Greetings, I'm Trevor Babb with the Contemporary Guitar Blog, and I have a very special guest with me today. Barry O'Halpin is joining me from Dublin, and Barry is a guitarist and composer in residence with the Crash Ensemble, Dublin's premier new music sinfonietta chamber orchestra ensemble. And Barry is here to talk about a new 3-track EP that Crash just released on their own label called Lipids that includes a piece for solo electric guitar, a piece for chamber ensemble with electric guitar, and a piece for just chamber ensemble without electric guitar. Barry, thanks so much for taking some time to chat with me about Lipids today, and it's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
Excellent. So let's just start a little bit with your background as a guitarist and how you got into playing the instrument, how you got into contemporary music, probably after the fact, and music composition and performing new music. Just give us the brief little biography of Barry as guitarist and composer.
Sure. So yeah, I would say it's kind of a messy but interesting patchwork of things, like a lot of musicians. So I would have started playing properly in my early teens, just like playing in bands, local bands with friends, and kind of, entering that kind of stage of when you first properly start listening to music and you get kind of obsessed with the music and with playing guitar, and everything kind of develops very quickly. So during that period, before that in life, I hadn't really taken to music much, but I was always had that kind of creative mind, if you know what I mean, like through various other media like art and drawing and all that stuff. But with guitar, I kind of was just listening to a lot of that typical kind of early teens rock music, all that stuff that gets you in, and playing in bands. But I think from the start with that stuff, as soon as I had a few chords, I was always trying to write music as well as learn music to play. And so I never really had that kind of like approach, that kind of cover band approach, if you know what I mean. It was always kind of like, oh, how can I be creative through this medium? But anyway, yeah. So I think like I got lessons, I got rock lessons, and later on some kind of slightly more jazz oriented lessons. But all the time I was playing with my bands and kind of, learning through writing terrible music and then writing slightly better music and playing at like parties and all that stuff. But I think what's interesting is I didn't have any grounding in classical guitar during that period. So like it was very much kind of like rock guitar, a bit of jazz, but then my listening kind of expanded over the years. And then by the time I was getting close to college age, I was listening to all sorts of music, from the kind of experimental side of rock. So a lot of kind of post-rock and instrumental stuff like Tortoise and Slint, but then like electronica, like, Boards of Canada, Aphex Twin. But then I was also getting kind of gravitating towards a lot of kind of contemporary classical music, usually kind of the easy entry points, like the kind of the Steve Reiches and the Philip Glasses and all that stuff, but
Yeah.
As well as the Stravinskys and Debussy and all that. And I think that's where kind of the guitar band approach kind of linked up with the kind of wider musical possibilities, and then the kind of idea that I write music in a band. I've been writing music for like 5 years, going from like very, very bad to okay, but only kind of after that experience that I kind of think, oh, maybe you could write music on scores and other people could play it and it would actually be a satisfying experience, as opposed to like, why am I playing there? So yeah, I didn't kind of come up with this very traditional idea of like wanting to be a composer since I sat at the piano age 4. It wasn't like that for me at all. It was more just a gradual thing. So by the time I went to college, I went to Trinity College in Dublin, and I did music with English in my undergrad. But while I was there, I kind of tried out a couple of like student ensemble composition things, and doing all the usual music college intense stuff. And I think working with or getting lessons from Donnacha Denny was a big thing as well in Trinity at the time, kind of 2008 2009 kind of time. And yeah, he made a big impact on a lot of us, just to kind of show us what was out there, and especially like kind of connect. A lot of what he was doing was connecting with a lot of the stuff that was going on in the States. So it was kind of nice to have a route into that. And then there are other people in and around the college at the time, like Linda Buckley was teaching us at the time. And I think a lot of Irish composers who've done stuff, here and in Europe and in the US have kind of come through. But yeah, so around that time, I kind of, when it comes to guitar, like a lot of that time I was playing with my band Alarmist, which before we were really Alarmist, we were kind of like an earlier version of it. But that was kind of the biggest part of my performance life. So I wasn't really like I wasn't a classical guitarist. I wasn't like a cover band or session guitarist. I was like a guitarist who almost always was playing in a kind of creative band mode, right? So it wasn't really this by the book approach to playing, or this kind of like standardized approach. It was always a little bit like off kilter, or a little bit kind of creatively focused, or however you might describe it in my approach. So, and I think in my head, I didn't think of myself as someone who will become a kind of ensemble musician the way I've kind of become now at that stage. But what I did start to do was I started to kind of bring that older, or that not older, but that more kind of eclectic, kind of non-classical mindset into my composition quite a bit more. So like, when I was in, my undergrad and all that, I was learning about all the kind of usual avant-garde 20th century, 21st century. And then, stuff like very kind of timbre-centric approaches to composition, and then also stuff like microtonality and spectral music and all that. And that kind of made me think about the instruments I had at hand differently, and think about how you can construct sound and construct musical ideas from those objects and those instruments that you can make any sound on, whether or not you're good at them. I think that's where a lot of that mindset kind of made a big impact on my writing, along with just like, all the composers and various music that made an impact on me. But so I think where that's going really is that that was kind of the start of me wanting to bring the electric guitar into the kind of composition world I was doing. So if you fast forward a couple of years, I was still doing stuff with my band Alarmist. We're putting out EPs and all that. And I go off and I do a master's over in London, Trinity Lab. And that's kind of where I push it a little further with the electric guitar and really explore. I write a couple of pieces where it's kind of focused on, microtonal tunings of the guitar, but also really leaning into the fact that it's an electric guitar rather than a classical guitar put onto an electric format, kind of using my own voice rather than trying to emulate another one, if you know what I mean. And I think that's from there, I feel there's a kind of direct line from that kind of time around, 2012, 2013, the pieces I started writing then and what I ended up doing, what I'm doing now, So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've answered the full question.
I think you have. I mean, one thing I want to ask you about is, was there any music that you heard while you were studying that used the electric guitar, and then you were like, oh, I could use this instrument that I know how to play? And was there anything that you heard that was like, oh, click, light bulb, like electric guitar, I can compose for electric guitar? Or was it something that kind of just was like, yeah, maybe I could use this instrument that I have lying around?
It was kind of more like that, the latter, right? But what's
really
interesting, well, what's interesting for me is like part of like the experience of going to, music college and just like learning a lot about, the more traditional aspects of, repertoire and harmony and all that, which I was kind of not totally clued into growing up that much. I was like more, it was more like my own interest that drove me towards learning more about the overall subject and how I could use it. But there's a bit of an inferiority where I wasn't like a pianist who was, you know, sight reading since I was a kid and kind of was you know, immersed in that kind of classical musician mindset. So for me, the guitar wasn't as well. It wasn't like this kind of fluent instrument that I could kind of like play score reductions on and really internalize all this kind of repertoire and theory and all this stuff that was I was soaking up. So it was interesting. There was a kind of disconnect between the two things, like my playing and my composition and my listening and all that stuff. But yeah, I think the click for me with that, with like really wanted to use my instrument, and because I wasn't like, you know, I wasn't playing in a kind of classical tradition of any description. Not that I pigeonhole myself into classical as like a label necessarily, but like the thing that really made an impact was when I was thinking about microtonality and kind of strange tuning systems. So like when I first got introduced to Harry Parch and like Julian Carrillo, neither of which I would say are like huge musical influences at all. But I think there was a talk I was at once by Bob Gilmore in around 2009 when I was an undergrad, and it just kind of blew my mind, just that kind of idea that you could squeeze between the pitches and create more pitches, and the fact that everything's just completely flexible and it's all just subjective, equal temperament. But the fact that you have these inventors who kind of would just basically invent their own instruments to create the music they wanted. And then you have people like Chelsea as well, who kind of did the same orchestral music. And then you have like the spectral composers who kind of just cracked sound open and, you know, made music out of it. That stuff made a big impact on me in terms of how I approached the guitar, because I was like, oh, I can just modify this instrument and use it to, you know, create this kind of eerie, very hands-on, very tactile, very sound-focused music. And I can do it in a way that doesn't require me to kind of communicate it to another musician and tell them to do it. Whereas with guitar, it was available to me, and you know, it's important to remember. It's important to say, and also for me to remember, that all this kind of composition time, even though it's a slow period to develop a voice that I'm kind of comfortable with, like I'm still writing a lot of music that's nothing to do with this kind of style, you know, through my band Alarmist, like collaboratively as well, and you know, it's just, this is one different mode of composition and approach to the instrument. But I think the other thing is it kind of that I was kind of, you know, even before I got anywhere near contemporary classical kind of thinking, or, you know, the composer mindset, I was always interested in alternate tunings on the guitar as well. And that kind of defamiliarizing effect that it has, where your muscle memory has to be remapped. And, you know, you're not really thinking about, oh, I'm playing a D and then there's another D over here. You know, you're just using the physical exploratory process of the instrument to, you know, create new interesting things. And you're kind of almost embracing the kind of an ignorance that comes with it.
Yeah, you know, Jonathan D'Souza has a great book that I need to read, where he talks about Kurt Rosenwinkel and his tune Zhivago, where he like totally messes up the tuning of the guitar in this really crazy way. And he talks about it as a voluntary act of self-sabotage. And, you know, so many other guitarists have taken that as a way to just find these new expressions of the instrument that aren't possible, whether we're talking about Sonic Youth or whatever. Like, this whole, like, you know, retune these 6 strings into something new is totally interesting. And I think some of our most exciting repertoire has kind of come from just retuning. And the new possibilities that affords us is just really, really exciting. Let's talk a little bit about Crash Ensemble. How did you get hooked up with Crash Ensemble? You've been involved with them for several years now. Talk about how that relationship started, and talk about how these 3 pieces that were just released on this EP came about through your work with Crash.
Sure thing. Yeah, so Well, I mean, Crash kind of, yeah, as you said, they're kind of like the most prominent contemporary music group in Dublin and in Ireland. And, you know, I was aware of them for a long time. And I suppose since I got interested in composing, I was always, you know, keen to eventually work with Crash in some way. Just mainly that in the earlier days, I was just like, oh, I'd love to have my music played by Crash. And that's kind of how I ended up working with Crash in the first place. So like about 2014, I had a piece which is on the new EP, Lethargerian. So it's like a, you know, full chamber ensemble piece, but funnily enough, without guitar in it. So it actually doesn't use the guitar, because maybe when I was writing it, I was thinking, well, I'm not in it, and if I'm not playing guitar, I'm more interested in focusing on the other instruments. You know, that might have been the mindset. But anyway, I wrote this piece and I sent it to a call for scores that Crash do every year called Freestyle, and it got picked for that, which was great, and performed, and that was back in 2014, so it's quite a while ago at this stage. But yeah, that was an amazing moment for me as a young composer, just to get that played to such a high level, and to kind of experience what the kind of professionalism and kind of good attitude of Crash, just even sitting in on rehearsals and just seeing it all to come together, because there's not so many opportunities to do that with an ensemble in Ireland anyway. You kind of have to find a way into the handful of groups that are working like that in Ireland, or else go to the UK or go to Europe and kind of try and get into a bigger pond. So it was amazing to get picked up for it. But anyway, yeah. So after that, I got that piece performed. It was great. That's what the recording is. It's actually that performance.
Oh wow!
Premiere that piece from that concert. So that's back in 2014. But then in about, I think later that year, kind of winter time that year, I was asked about if I had any music to give them for a tour that they were doing, kind of a showcase tour. So it was with a few different composers. So like there's myself and Amanda Feary and Jonathan Angle, Ben Schlepper-Connolly, Emma O'Halloran. I think they were the five for the tour. And it was I didn't have a piece ready for the configuration, so I went ahead and I wrote a new one, basically, which I was kind of had in my head anyway, and that actually is what became Lipids, which is the title track. So this was like late 2014 into early 2015, and it was really that piece that brought the guitar in to writing for Crash, and I think kind of inadvertently ended up being the thing that got me into Crash as a performer. So basically I wrote, but what's interesting, so on the EP, that's the title track, and that was recorded in 2015 as well. So it's not a brand new recording by any means. It's a new record. But the performer is actually John Godfrey on that recording, because at the time of recording, I wasn't a performer in Crash. I was a composer still. So it's interesting. It's kind of like this transitional period where I kind of ended up getting absorbed into the group. So basically that went really well, and there was Crash performed that and they toured it with the other pieces, and then eventually, because John wasn't available for a gig, I was asked to come and play the piece with them. And at the time I was kind of daunted, because I wasn't used to it. Basically, I wasn't used to ensemble playing at the time, and I was a bit kind of like, I've been playing music in my band that was tricky and weird and choreographed and changing Ableton patches and playing weird riffs, hitting pedals and all that stuff. I've done all that, and I wasn't scared of performance. I was just intimidated by the kind of more regimented nature of the ensemble, or kind of an orchestral approach to being a performer, which at the time I was totally green in, but eventually I was like, right, I'll just do it. But also I had to contend then with playing off my own part, which like I was also kind of daunted by, because I wasn't like used to writing this really complex guitar music on a score and then reading off it myself. I was,
Yeah.
this is the score I've created from all this patchwork of recordings and sketches that I've made. And so it was interesting. And then I kind of became a member kind of tentatively, first just to perform my own music and a couple of other things. But then eventually I got invited to join as a kind of ongoing member. But around the same time, I was also offered a composer in residence kind of position. So essentially it was the things happened at the same time. So I was like, okay, new guitarist plus composer in residence. And that's kind of culminated now. So basically during that composer in residence period, I was writing a really big piece that is going to be premiered in a few weeks. So it's called Wing Form, and it's in 4 ensemble movements. But part of that larger composition is solo guitar music, 2 pieces, one of which is Stridula on the new recording. Okay. And they're kind of, the concept was essentially that the solo guitar passages would be like a connective tissue for the larger ensemble movements. So you have a kind of, not only is Stridula a standalone piece in this new EP, it's actually part of this bigger piece as well, kind of broken little parts and distributed around the pieces, around the movements rather. But yeah, so that's kind of been the creative focus the last few years for me, and you know, amongst other things. But yeah, I mean, aside from that, obviously, you know, I since I first started playing with Crash, I've, you know, played an absolute ton of performance situations and different, you know, premieres and tours and festivals and stuff. So it's been an amazing few years of just like total change for me anyway. Musically, it's been great.
Yeah. So we have Lipids, Lethargerian, and Stridula. Like, coming in from the outside, not knowing anything, I'd think we were listening to a metal album. Talk about these titles. They're so evocative, and I just want to know more about them and why you attached them to the title page of these pieces.
I never thought about it that way, but you're kind of right, aren't you? So Lipids, Lipids was like, I think it kind of emerged after the fact, but I think it's a good title to evoke the kind of, I suppose, visual imagery, because I think with that piece it was channeling this kind of response to like a lot of microscopic film and that kind of microbiology world that you gain access to through that, and like you're responding to that like just in a very like abstract way, not in a kind of sciencey way, just in a like, what does that look like, how does it move, and what does it make me think and feel in reaction. So that was kind of, funnily enough, I was doing a part-time job at the time that before composing it, where I had to like transcribe biology lectures, so for a student. So basically I was kind of interested, like I was just overhearing these like lectures, like, oh, that's actually kind of cool, probably getting the wrong message altogether, but just getting some kind of creative visual sonic ideas from it. And so lipids, you know, basically fat molecules, oil molecules. Right. It just stuck. It was, I just thought it was a cool word in itself, and it kind of, I don't know, it kind of sums up the sound world and the motion of the different gestures and the instruments and the way they interact, and that kind of sense, I think, that's in the music, at least what I'm trying to get across, that sense of a void that has these objects in it, but you're kind of feeling the weight of the void between them as well, you know, and them kind of regrouping and kind of clustering. So that's, you know, I suppose that's a way of describing the title, but it's also a way of describing what's going on in the music on a more broad strokes way, because it's very hard to describe in specific detail, to be honest, with that piece. It's a very kind of intuitive kind of piece, I think. But then with Lethargerian, that's actually borrowed from, there was a book by an author who died recently, actually a few weeks ago, called The Phantom Tollbooth. It's a children's book, 60s. Norton Juster is the author, and the title came from that, because originally there was there was elements of text from that book used as a kind of material in the ensemble piece, like to kind of, you know, use as ciphers for rhythms and for kind of attack gestures. And, you know, it's not like an area of composition that I've really pursued any further, but it was at the time that was kind of what was driving that. But the name stuck for sure as a kind of, 'cause it's just interesting in itself. It's just this odd word that makes sense when you see it, but you've never seen it before, you know, unless you read that.
Yeah, I read that book when I was probably like 12.
Same here.
Yeah.
Same here. And I think at the time, you know, I was interested in kind of looking back to kind of literary ideas as a musical source material. And I suppose that's how it ended up going that way. But yeah, it's quite, I suppose it's quite different in a lot of ways from what I've ended up doing in the last few years. But I think musically, there's a lot of stuff in that piece that carries through to a lot of my recent stuff, and the stuff that will be part of Wing Form when we release that soon. But and then Stridula is a kind of a half made up word as well. It's that I half made up. So it's basically the piece, you know, a lot of it is kind of just emerges from a really hands-on guitar process and kind of generating material that way. I mean, I can talk more specifically if you have questions about that stuff later, but it actually part of the material is a found sound, basically a archive recording of a beetle stridulating, so just, you know, basically chattering, and the stridulation is basically the friction of the I believe it's the shell against the wing, or shell against the body, you know. So basically it's that kind of friction that creates that kind of click or scrape or sound. And it actually describes the whole sound world of the piece quite well, because it's kind of mimicking that in the rest of the piece. And then at one stage at the very end, it actually is a transcription of that specific recording, and it kind of captures the rhythm and contour and a bit of the timbre as well, I think. But yeah, just well, I kind of like those titles that are like a word that is abstracted from something else, so it's something new, you know. So that's kind of one of those.
So your compositional writing is just so textural and very focused on timbre. Talk a little bit about how you conceptualize textures and timbres and how that relates to form, and how you arrive at these methods of producing these sounds on your instrument and others.
Okay, so yeah, I guess I'll start with Lipids, because that's a very textural timbral piece. Well, that one is a kind of prime example of, I suppose, where a lot of that comes from. So like that piece, the process of composing that was probably one of the most tactile processes of any piece I've done, you know, maybe not including the solo guitar pieces, but basically a lot of the material for not just for the electric guitar, but also for the bass clarinet and the cello in that piece, they came from my own kind of hands-on recordings and like improvisations, and, you know, patching together short sounds and little clips of me playing on the electric guitar and on a bass clarinet that I have at home that I can play to a very basic level. And also a really old cello that I think I played for about a year before I got anywhere near being kind of interested in music. So I had this children-sized cello lying around. But basically, I used those instruments in the composition process, and it became probably, with that piece, more the recording became central to the process as much as the score. And then the score was kind of, you know, assembling the ideas together, figuring out how to notate them specifically. But it kind of shows that sometimes the process of composition starts with the instrument and starts with the sound, and without the notation as a kind of mediation. And I think that that kind of very tactile approach, where especially when you're approaching an instrument as an outsider. So like for me, it's like approaching clarinet as an outsider, as in I have about a year's worth of lessons, that I did over a decade ago, but that's about it. But I've always loved using the instrument to kind of explore multiphonics, and not just the ones you see in charts and books as a composer. I mean, like just the more strange liminal in between sounds that you get from lifting the wrong finger at the wrong time, and like a very clumsy version of like Evan Parker sax stuff. But yeah, and I've actually found a lot of that kind of approach to instruments I don't play has really informed my writing, and I like that kind of really not difficult to achieve, but still very textured, kind of fluctuating area of instrumental color. And I like finding ways to integrate that into the music. And sometimes it looks complicated on the page because you have to communicate it to the player. Like often it's something that I just achieved with zero technique and just a bit of noodling. But yeah, and I think that's generally, I think a lot of that approach to composition, like in Lipids, comes from back when I was talking about like that experience of being a guitarist but not being a kind of piano composer who sits down and plays through ideas fluently and all that. So I think a lot of my composition started veering towards recording little patchworks of ideas, like a bit of audio, a bit of MIDI, and putting it together as a way of bypassing some of those problems. Because you know yourself as well, you don't, Sibelius and notation software like that can be a bit of a drag sometimes when you're composing, because it doesn't give you any timbre or texture really. It kind of bypasses that.
And talk a bit about it sounds like Stridula was a very hands-on approach to developing timbre on the guitar too. Talk a little bit about that and how you arrive at these sounds that we hear in that piece. And I mean, you have this Beatle recording that you're using and you're trying to mimic that, of course, but talk a little bit more about the ways that you constructed the sound world of that piece.
Yeah, so that was a piece that was kind of swimming around in my head as a possibility for quite a while before I did it. And it's all based around one technique, which is kind of one that I haven't seen a whole lot of in the guitar world, whether the classical or the rock or the everything in between world. Basically, a long time ago, probably before I got anywhere near writing notes on paper, I messed around with a kind of percussive harmonics approach, where essentially I'm doing a natural harmonic, or artificial harmonic rather, where I'm touching the node with my right hand and then I'm hammering on with the left hand, right? And it was kind of, at the time, it was like, oh, I haven't really seen people do this. I'm sure they have done it, but I haven't seen them do it. So I kind of used it.
There's a cool Elliott Sharp piece for classical guitar that does that.
Exactly. So like, it's not necessarily unprecedented at all, but it's just unconventional. At least it was when I was using it, not even in a kind of experimental contemporary classical framework at that time. At that time, I was just using it as a kind of, kalimba, marimba-esque timbre in a kind of quite math rocky setting in my band, Alarmist. So it was kind of like, I was using this kind of harmonic sound and layering it up with loop pedals, and then kind of just having this almost like thumb piano kind of layered percussion ensemble kind of sound with all that. But anyway, I kind of so that was there, and I used that in a few songs with the band, which again is that more kind of post rock, experimental rock context. And I kind of thought there's got to be a lot of potential in this technique to write a more extended piece, because there's a lot of nuance you can explore within that. And but yeah, so only like a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I kind of was writing little sketches for it and trying to use the kind of, when you're on stage with a band playing kind of loud, even if it's like experimental or left field kind of versions of rock music, it's still loud and it's still not exactly the most intimate sonically, you know.
Right.
So I kind of thought, well, if you write a solo instrument or solo instrumental in this more kind of, you know, sit down and shut up world of experimental music, you have more freedom to explore these very delicate sounds.
Yeah.
And that's what I was interested in with this piece. So, you know, I had a few sketches that were exploring those really kind of delicate kind of textural elements and those kind of transitional sounds that you get out of this technique when you kind of use different types of hammer-ons and double stops and kind of fluctuating elements and trills and all that kind of stuff. But with Stridula, yeah, those ideas started to kind of pair up with the other ideas I was getting interested in with kind of transcriptions of like non-human aspects of nature. So kind of trawling through bioacoustics databases for interesting sounds that are made by animals, made by insects, made by all kind of creatures, but trying to find interesting stuff that sounded kind of like music, but weird enough to bring something new and strange and uncanny into the music. And I guess just listening to a lot of that stuff was influencing my approach to Stridula, that kind of percussively oriented, very spacious kind of sound that it has. Kind of generally, it's kind of has a bit of a, you know, frogs and insects chirping feel to it. But then the specific sample I eventually found worked really well when I transcribed it. And that became kind of this end goal of the piece. So at the end of the piece, you have this kind of explosion of this like scraping, kind of weirdly grooving stridulation. And that's kind of like the final point. But then the rest of the piece kind of builds up to it and doesn't necessarily use the same material. It kind of, it's more like an extended exploration of those earlier kind of timbre specific ideas that I had. But essentially the whole piece, it kind of emerged from modifications of that technique. So like, you know, I'd start off and I'd be putting my finger on the octave harmonic basically, and I'd just be kind of hammering a pattern. And also, by the way, it's in scordatura kind of detuning, so it's like roughly based on a G harmonic series. So it has a really low E string, like tuned down like a sixth to G.
Okay.
And then lots of like, you know, tweaked kind of minus. Everything's kind of rounded to about minus 20 cent if it's microtonal. So it has this very kind of, you know, that kind of funky harmonic series kind of sound to it. And again, that kind of gives you that reinvention of the fretboard and that exploratory element where I don't know what's going to happen if I do this, so I'm going to see what happens, you know. So that's a big part of the process. But yeah, other techniques kind of came out of it. So like just simple stuff, but that had a very complex result. So if I was doing a pattern in the left hand, like, and just kept repeating it, and then my right hand just kind of slid through the harmonics, kind of went to another node, it would get this kind of transitional sound. And and the main precedent for that, when I kind of, you know, I was doing I just kind of finished a PhD over the last few years, composition one, and so I had to do a lot of like check for precedents. so I'm not completely ignoring them, but because the idea came to me in a vacuum, but I kind of wanted to make sure I was like, right, who's done this as well? And the main proponents of that specific one were just all 80s shred metal, all Van Halen, all kind of just like that rolling harmonics with like saturated with distortion and just like total kind of stadium guitar solo stuff. So I was kind of like, right, that's pretty far away from what I'm going for here. So I feel pretty safe exploring it in this context. And I'm sure it's come up in a lot of guitarists. You know, it's not a difficult technique. It's just, you know, a bit backwards in terms of what you would normally do. But I guess what I was doing was a sustained exploration of it. So it's like, it's not only about the kind of static sound of the percussion. It's about the kind of transitional sounds that happen between. And I think that's where it's kind of a lot of the interest of the piece is. It kind of goes from this stable kind of harmonic kind of place to this very metallic kind of quite abrasive sound where, like, you know, and along with that, the rhythm kind of tightens up. So it goes from this very exploratory, almost sounding improvised place to this very super tight kind of really locked in rhythms, kind of very like loops that are kind of closing into themselves and then becoming saturated with like really rapid material. So it's kind of playing with that stuff as well. Like it's kind of almost lulling you into a feeling of, oh, this is just an improvised kind of landscape, and then it really kind of tightens itself up, and then it kind of explodes at the end with that transcribed sound. But and in terms of, I suppose, what allows that technique to work is the fact that I basically need to have a quite a strong boost on the instrument in order to make it actually work. And the amp needs to be pretty loud. So you're basically playing what is mostly very delicate stuff on this very loud amp with like quite a high gain. So I think that's the reason why it's not such a common technique either. It's like it needs these conditions to work. And the reverb obviously is part of it too, because the reverb changes the character as well, because
and so you're dealing with a pretty delicate instrumental ecosystem here where you have to be incredibly careful or you're going to get some really loud sounds that you don't want to hear.
Absolutely, yeah. And like, because what's interesting is I haven't given the piece to anyone else to try yet. I'm sure it'd be great if people put it. Yeah, I'll send you the score. But I'll actually, I can share. I think you're probably going to ask me about this in a second, so I can share the score after. But I think that's the interesting thing, is like hoping that the whole essence of the piece is carried through.
Yeah.
In the notation.
Let's see it. Let's talk about notation. And how are you instructing other players to replicate what you've done?
Well, that's kind of the the first version I was performing off was my handwritten version, which was very much like what I decided to do was I decided to go completely the tab route rather than the transposed version of standard guitar notation. Not only because it kind of it says something about my roots as a player, even though I don't routinely read off tab nowadays. It does say something about my kind of, when it comes to retuned radical scordatura, it just seemed much more practical to do it this way. And also because the sound has almost nothing to do with the standardized notes that you're putting your fingers on. So for me,
we talked through all this stuff at a pub in Dublin.
We did, yeah. I was talking to you about the concept for it, I think, and how I'd go about it, and I went kind of. What I've done is, I've kind of notated the pitches, approximate pitches above it, which some people might benefit from, but it's just in case, just so there's some reference to what it should sound like, but. So the score kind of emerged. I had my notation for myself, and then there's certain things I tried to tighten up a little bit for, other performers to use. But you can see here that I've kind of done my best here to communicate to other would-be players, and I'd love to see what happens when they take it on, because there's probably very peculiar, specific things that have to be right in order for it to work. Because it's not a piece that you can just pick up and practice on an acoustic either. It's not going to sound anything like it sounds unless you have the right conditions, basically. But you can see here, like, there's specifics of like what effects to use, what pickup to use, and it doesn't work on every single guitar. Like, I have two guitars. I have a Gibson 339 that it just doesn't really work on, but I have a Fender Tele with humbuckers that it does work on perfectly. So I kind of have to, I have to stick with one guitar for it. And I'm not sure exactly what the cause is. I don't know if it's to do with the pickups or to do with the build of the guitar, or to do with the kind of, one guitar having a more mellowed out timbre, but I'll have to figure it out for posterity. You can see here there's like the kind of semi-improvised kind of elements that I've put in for myself and for whoever takes it on. So I have the kind of open-ended repeats where you can kind of interpret them to repeat a gesture or repeat an idea that's just happened for as long as you need to, and just to give the piece room essentially to kind of breathe. And that's great for me as a performer, And I'm sure it will be handy for anyone executing it, because they know they don't have to like slavishly keep an eye on every single instance. You know, they know where they can relax a little bit and then when they can tighten it up again.
Yeah.
So yeah, and here's the crux of how I'm trying to tackle the notation for that technique. So basically, I'm using this tab approach. So you can see there, that's kind of just these pretty standard pull-offs repeating here. But then I have this diamond with the number, the fret that's being covered in the right hand, the node, and above it you have the approximate notation. And then I'm kind of doing this transitional stuff here, where basically it's showing when there's a change between one node and another one using arrows.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this other technique actually where essentially I'm just pressuring the harmonic into a fully stopped note, and there's actually notes being sounded behind it just through really aggressive hammer-ons and pull-offs, and it kind of creates this weird shimmering bitone thing where you get the bitones either side of the fingers on the right hand side. So you basically get a louder one here, and then you get the kind of faint shimmer of what's happening on the other side of the finger. So kind of mirage effect. But anyway, so this is kind of what it ends up looking like. So, you know, it's probably, like a lot of scores, probably more daunting to look at than it is to play in some ways. But you know, I'll be interested to see how people respond to it. But there's a lot of room to, as you can see with these repeat marks, to kind of extend an idea, or kind of like go by feel with how long a gesture should be. And I think that's part of the language of the piece as well. Like it has that kind of varied repetition quality and that kind of spacious quality that you can kind of really sink into. But you can see here, like certain bars are just all repeats, and there's you know, there's often an opportunity to make a repeat go on longer than it's written, or shorter than it's written, or whatever way works for you. So yeah, I mean, it gets kind of intense here, all this stuff.
Yeah,
well,
it looks like a little bit of work.
Yeah, I mean it is, but I think that the understanding the kind of mechanical motions you have to do with your left hand, and then realizing how radically different the results are sonically depending on where the right hand is, kind of can help you understand what's going on. And also you kind of you probably, you know, if you listen to the recording and you kind of follow with the score, you probably get a feel for what's more subjective in terms of how you would interpret it, you know what I mean? So there's bits where there's a rush of notes, and it's such a transitional sound that you can kind of, you'd probably be able to judge listening to it. Okay, this is kind of a more transitional passage, so I can be a little bit more kind of fast and loose with this. But then this bit's a lot more measured. You know, when you have the time signatures kind of plunked in, suddenly it's a bit more disciplined. You know.
Yeah.
But the main thing is not to be too scared of all this microtonal stuff. You know, I mean, I've just handed in a thesis, so I think I played on the safe side by just putting in all these scary quarter tones and like -8 tones. But you know, if you keep your eyes on the prize, it's not so bad.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can see here it gets super rhythmically kind of tightened up and quite groovy at these bits. Which is a total contrast to the start of it. And then at the end here, you can kind of see the stridulation coming in. So you can see there again, it's kind of quite tightly organized. And you see some kind of new techniques, like just kind of thumb scraping on the strings and popping against the pickups.
I love that sound. There's like this like kiss of reverb that's really like mesmerizing on the recording that I just love.
Yeah, I was really happy with how that worked out. It's and like it shouldn't be that surprising as a sound, but it is. It's kind of underused, you know. Like that's another thing.
They're like smooches of reverb. It's so cool.
That's the thing. Like, so I suppose that relates as well to the kind of timbre approach to composition. Like with the electric guitar, a lot of my experience has been that there's so many underused sounds that come directly out of the instrument itself once it's, you know, amplified a little bit and maybe has a touch of reverb. And I think reverb itself, you know, obviously it's like an atmosphere button, but it's also it extends the sound in ways that make certain pieces possible. And I think this is a perfect example, this piece, because this piece doesn't really work without reverb, because so much of it is about this kind of transitional harmony that and kind of like this kind of unsettled texture that happens when you go from one state to another, and when you have this kind of left hand kind of rapid material, and a lot of that kind of transitional sound gets carried on by the reverb, and it kind of creates its own like background chord, if you know what I mean, or background harmony. And some of the kind of more incidental quick sounds, like, you know, the little hammer-ons that are just like a very staccato kind of sound, they just get carried on by the reverb as well, and they kind of take on a whole new weight and build up a whole new kind of harmony in themselves. So I think I wouldn't play it without reverb really, because it just wouldn't have the same timbre, it wouldn't have the same kind of enveloping quality, and it's not just effect, it's actually part of the kind of conditions of the piece, I would say.
Well, excellent, Barry. This has been a very riveting conversation.
Very good.
And if you want to check out Lipids, it's available for streaming on Spotify. I'm sure you can purchase it somewhere. And thanks so much for sitting down and talking about your work and your approach to the guitar. All very, very interesting stuff.
Thanks very much. It was a pleasure.